The Vance estate was less a home and more a monument to dynastic wealth. Sprawling across 10 acres of meticulously manicured Connecticut countryside, the Georgian mansion stood as a proud, stone-faced testament to the fortune Arthur Vance Sr. had amassed in shipping and logistics. His son, Arthur Vance Jr., had inherited not only the fortune and the house but also his father's kind heart and a somewhat naive belief in the inherent goodness of people. At 52, Arthur was a man of gentle disposition, with laugh lines etched around his pale blue eyes and a dusting of silver at his temples. His greatest treasure, he often told his closest friend, Benjamin Carter, was not the portfolio of stocks or the collection of impressionist art, but his wife, Eleanor. Eleanor Vance was, by all accounts, flawless. 20 years Arthur's junior, she possessed a beauty that seemed almost classical, as if sculpted from marble by a master artisan. Her raven-black hair was often swept into an elegant chignon. Her figure was slender and graceful, and her smile could disarm the most cynical of business rivals. She was the perfect hostess, a devoted wife, a patron of the arts, and the glittering centerpiece of their social circle. She had met Arthur at a charity gala she had helped organize. She was a rising star in the event-planning world, a woman of ambition and charm who seemed utterly captivated by the quiet, unassuming billionaire. Their courtship was a whirlwind romance straight from a storybook, culminating in a lavish wedding that was the talk of the society pages for months. To the outside world, they were the epitome of happiness. But a gilded cage is still a cage, and behind the opulent facade of her perfect life, Eleanor was suffocating. She hadn't married Arthur for love. She had married him for what he represented: security, status, and, most importantly, an escape from the gnawing poverty that had defined her childhood. She had played her part brilliantly, learning his tastes, mirroring his interests, and reflecting his affection with a carefully constructed warmth. She lavished him with attention, praised his business acumen, and soothed his anxieties. But every night, as she lay beside him in their cavernous bedroom, a cold knot of resentment tightened in her stomach. She despised his gentle touch, his trusting nature, his complete and utter obliviousness to the predator sleeping in his bed. He was not a partner, he was an obstacle with a 9-figure net worth. The first seed of the plan was planted on their second anniversary. Arthur, in a fit of romantic sentimentality, had taken her to see his lawyer, Jonathan Mills, to update his will. He wanted to ensure Eleanor would be taken care of for the rest of her life. Eleanor had sat through the meeting, a picture of loving gratitude, as Mills outlined the terms. The mansion, a generous trust fund that would provide an annual income of nearly $1 million, and all her jewelry and personal effects. It was a fortune by any normal standard. But Eleanor's standards were anything but normal. And the remainder of the estate, Mills had continued, peering over his spectacles, some 70%, will be divided equally between the Vance Family Charitable Foundation and the Children's Hospital of New York, as per Arthur's long-standing wishes. 70%. The number had echoed in her mind, a discordant clang in the symphony of her ambitions. She would be a wealthy widow, yes, but she would not have control. She would be a caretaker of a fortune, not its master. The bulk of her hard-earned prize, for she considered her marriage a long and arduous performance, would be given away to sick children and faceless charities. The injustice of it burned like acid. Arthur saw it as his legacy. Eleanor saw it as a theft. That night, the plan began to crystallize. Divorce was not an option. The prenuptial agreement was ironclad, leaving her with far less than the will would. She needed to be a widow, a grieving, heartbroken widow who would inherit everything, which meant the will had to change and Arthur had to go. The method had to be subtle, untraceable. A sudden, violent end would invite too much scrutiny. It needed to look like a tragedy, not a crime. Her research began in the dead of night, in the privacy of her study, using an encrypted browser on a laptop purchased with cash. She delved into the arcane world of toxicology, learning about poisons that mimicked natural diseases, substances that degraded quickly in the body, leaving behind only ambiguous symptoms. She dismissed common poisons like arsenic and cyanide as too clumsy, too easily detected. She needed something more sophisticated. She found it in a book on historical assassinations, thallium. A heavy metal, tasteless and odorless, once used in rat poison but now heavily restricted. In small, repeated doses, its effects were insidious. It attacked the nervous system, causing symptoms that could be easily mistaken for a rare neurological disorder. Fatigue, nausea, hair loss, chronic pain, and a slow, agonizing decline. It was perfect. Obtaining it was a challenge, but through a series of anonymous transactions on the dark web, a small, lead-lined vial containing a crystalline salt arrived discreetly in a package addressed to a P.O. box she had opened under a false name. The poisoning began on a Tuesday in early spring. Arthur had a ritual. Every morning, he would drink a large glass of freshly squeezed orange juice that Eleanor prepared for him. It was their quiet moment before the day began. As she stood in the vast, sun-drenched kitchen, the gleaming stainless steel appliances reflecting her serene expression, she used a tiny, almost microscopic scoop to add a few grains of the thallium salt to his glass. It dissolved instantly, leaving no trace. "Here you are, my love," she said, her voice a silken caress as she handed him the glass. He took it with a smile, his eyes full of adoration. He drank it all, thanking her for taking such good care of him. Eleanor felt a faint, cold thrill as she watched him swallow his own death sentence. The first symptoms appeared a few weeks later. Arthur began complaining of a deep, unshakable fatigue. He, a man who usually rose at dawn for a 5-mile run, could barely make it through the day without a nap. "Must be stress," he'd say, rubbing his temples. "This merger is taking a lot out of me." Eleanor was the picture of concern. She insisted he see a doctor, shepherding him to appointments with the best specialists in New York. She would sit in their plush offices, her hand resting gently on Arthur's arm, her face a mask of worried devotion as he described his symptoms. The doctors were puzzled. Blood tests came back inconclusive. They suggested changes to his diet, more rest, less stress. As weeks turned into months, Arthur's condition worsened. A persistent nausea set in. He lost his appetite and began to lose weight. Then came the pains in his legs, a burning, tingling sensation that made walking difficult. He had to start using a cane. Eleanor adjusted her routine accordingly. She canceled social engagements, citing her need to be by her husband's side. She redecorated a downstairs suite so he wouldn't have to climb the stairs. She managed his medications, his diet, his schedule, effectively isolating him from the outside world. His friend, Ben Carter, was the first to become truly suspicious. Ben had known Arthur since their college days and saw him as a brother. He found Eleanor's flawless devotion unsettling. "It's her eyes," he told his own wife one night, nursing a whiskey. "She looks at him, and it's like she's looking at a project, not a person. There's no grief there, just focus." Ben tried to visit often, but Eleanor always had an excuse. "Arthur is sleeping. The doctor just left, and he needs his rest. He's not feeling up to visitors today, Ben. He sends his love." When he did manage to see Arthur, he was shocked by his friend's rapid decline. Arthur's skin had a grayish pallor, and his once thick silver hair was thinning noticeably. He seemed confused, his memory lapsing. "Are the doctors sure about what this is?" Ben asked him one afternoon, sitting by his bedside. Arthur sighed, his voice weak. "They're throwing around names. Polyneuropathy, Guillain-Barré syndrome. But nothing fits perfectly. Eleanor has been a saint through all of this. I don't know what I'd do without her." Eleanor entered the room just then, carrying a tray with a cup of tea. She smiled warmly at Ben, but he saw a flicker of ice in her gaze. "Ben, how lovely of you to visit. But I think it's time for Arthur's medicine and his rest." It was a polite but firm dismissal. As Ben left the estate that day, a cold dread settled in his gut. Something was terribly wrong. With Arthur growing weaker and more dependent, Eleanor moved to the second phase of her plan. The will. Forgery was a delicate art. She spent weeks practicing Arthur's signature, studying dozens of documents he had signed. She learned the unique pressure he applied on his downstrokes, the slight flourish at the end of his E. She purchased vintage paper from the same manufacturer his lawyer used and sourced a specific brand of fountain pen ink that matched his preference. She drafted the new will herself, its language simple and direct. It revoked all previous testaments. It named her, Eleanor Marie Vance, as the sole executrix and sole beneficiary of the entire Vance estate, from the last stock certificate to the last silver teaspoon. The charitable foundations were erased. His distant cousins were erased. Everyone was erased except for her. The final piece was the witnesses. A valid will required two. She couldn't risk using real people who could be questioned. So she invented them. She created two identities, Susan Peterson and Robert Jones, complete with fake signatures she had also perfected. Her story would be that Arthur, in a moment of lucidity and foresight, had called in two of the household staff, a maid and a gardener who had since been dismissed, to witness the signing in private, not wanting to trouble his lawyer with what he saw as a simple change. It was a flimsy story, but with Arthur gone, who could contradict it? The perfect opportunity came on a stormy October night. Arthur had a particularly bad day, racked with pain and disoriented from his medication. Eleanor had given him a sedative prescribed by his doctor, and he was drifting in and out of consciousness. His hand lay limp on the coverlet. With the new will laid out on the bedside table, she gently took his hand, wrapped his fingers around the fountain pen, and painstakingly guided his hand to trace the signature she had practiced 1,000 times. It was a grotesque mockery of their wedding vows, a final, intimate act of betrayal. The result was nearly perfect. Then, below his, she added the fluid signatures of Susan Peterson and Robert Jones. She tucked the document into a safe in Arthur's study, behind a first edition of Moby Dick. Her heart was beating a steady, calm rhythm. There was no excitement, no fear. There was only the cold, clear certainty of a predator closing in on its prey. She went back to Arthur's bedside, wiped his brow with a cool cloth, and whispered, "It's almost over, my love. Soon you'll be at peace." The autumn that followed was a masterpiece of performance art. As the leaves on the ancient oaks of the Vance estate turned from gold to crimson and finally to a skeletal brown, Arthur's life withered in perfect, tragic synchrony. Eleanor, in stark contrast, bloomed. She was a constant, graceful presence at his side, a figure of saintly endurance that drew gasps of admiration from their dwindling circle of visitors. She read to him from his favorite poets, her voice a soothing balm against the backdrop of his pained, shallow breathing. She spoon-fed him the nutrient-rich broths that were all he could stomach, her touch gentle, her expression one of unending compassion. But each spoonful was a lie, a carefully measured dose of both sustenance and poison. The thallium was working its dark magic with brutal efficiency. Arthur was now confined to his bed, his muscles atrophied, his body a roadmap of agony. The burning in his limbs was a constant fire, and his once sharp mind was now a foggy labyrinth where memories flickered and died. The most devastating symptom for him was the loss of his hair. It came out in clumps on his pillow, a visible, humiliating sign of his body's surrender. Eleanor would brush it away with a sad sigh, telling him it was merely a side effect of a new, aggressive medication the specialists had recommended. There was, of course, no new medication. There were only the tasteless crystals she continued to stir into his tea and water. The doctors remained mystified. They subjected him to a battery of painful test nerve conduction studies, a spinal tap, multiple MRIs. The results were a frustrating collage of anomalies that pointed to a severe, progressive neuropathy but refused to coalesce into a single, diagnosable disease. They spoke in hushed, somber tones with Eleanor in the hallway, praising her fortitude. "You are a pillar of strength, Mrs. Vance," Dr. Albright, a renowned neurologist, told her, his eyes full of sympathy. "In all my years, I've rarely seen such devotion. He's a very lucky man." Eleanor simply lowered her eyes, a single perfect tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I am the lucky one," she whispered, "for every moment I have left with him." Behind this flawless facade of the grieving wife, Eleanor was a whirlwind of cold, calculated activity. Her primary focus was managing information and access. She became the sole gatekeeper to Arthur. Ben Carter's calls became increasingly frantic. He was no longer asking to visit. He was demanding it. "Eleanor, I need to see him," he insisted during one tense phone call. "It's been 3 weeks. This isn't right. Ben, please try to understand." Eleanor's voice was strained, as if holding back a sob. "He's in so much pain. The slightest excitement exhausts him. The doctors have insisted on absolute quiet. It's what's best for Arthur. Let me be the judge of that. He's my best friend. And he's my husband," she retorted, her voice cracking with manufactured anguish. "Do you think this is easy for me? To see him like this? Every decision I make is to protect him, to give him a shred of peace. I will not have him agitated. I'm sorry, Ben." She hung up, her hands steady, her face a blank mask. Ben was a problem, a loose thread in her carefully woven tapestry of deceit. He had to be kept at bay until the end. She used her isolation of Arthur to reinforce the narrative of his declining mental state, a crucial element for validating the forged will. On the rare occasions a nurse or a physical therapist was present, Eleanor would gently ask Arthur questions she knew he couldn't answer. "Do you remember what we talked about yesterday, my love? About the charities?" Arthur would just stare blankly, his eyes clouded with pain and confusion. Eleanor would then turn to the nurse with a look of profound sadness. "Some days are better than others," she would murmur. "His mind comes and goes. A few weeks ago he had a moment of pure clarity. He was worried about the future, about me being left alone. He insisted on making some changes to his affairs, to simplify things. He wanted me to be protected." She was planting the seeds, creating a backstory for the will's sudden and drastic revision. Her nights were spent not in vigil by his bedside, but in his vast, mahogany-paneled study. With Arthur confined to his room, the study had become her command center. It was there she finalized the details of her future. She studied his investment portfolios, making lists of assets to be liquidated. She researched offshore banking regulations and countries with no extradition treaties, a contingency plan for a worst-case scenario she deemed highly unlikely. Her confidence was absolute. She had built a fortress of lies, and its walls seemed impenetrable. The forged will was her masterpiece. She had aged the document meticulously, leaving it on a windowsill in direct sunlight for several days to give the paper a subtle, yellowed patina, then folding and unfolding it repeatedly to create natural creases. She'd even used a fine mist of water and a cool iron to simulate the effects of humidity over time. She had gone over the signatures of the fictitious witnesses, Susan Peterson and Robert Jones, again and again, ensuring they were distinct from her own handwriting and from each other. They were the ghosts in her machine, the silent accomplices to her crime. One evening, as a storm raged outside, lashing rain against the tall, arched windows of the study, Eleanor felt a surge of impatience. Arthur's decline had stalled. He was clinging to life with a tenacity that she found deeply inconvenient. Her supply of thallium was running low, and the process was taking far longer than she had anticipated. The constant performance was draining, and the risk of discovery, however small, grew with each passing day. She decided to escalate. She went to his room, her movements fluid and silent in the dim light. He was asleep, his breathing a faint, ragged whisper. On his bedside table was a glass of water and the array of pill bottles that constituted his palliative care painkillers, anti-nausea medication, sedatives. His primary painkiller was a powerful liquid opioid, prescribed to be administered in small, carefully measured doses. Eleanor picked up the bottle. The label warned of respiratory depression in case of overdose. Her hands did not tremble. Her heart did not race. She measured out a dose 3 times the prescribed amount into a syringe. She mixed it into his water, swirling the glass until the clear liquid was fully incorporated. She then gently shook him awake. "Arthur, my love, it's time for your medicine," she whispered, her voice a soft lullaby. He blinked, his eyes struggling to focus on her face. "Eleanor," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "The pain. I know, my darling. This will help," she said, lifting the glass to his lips. Drink it all. It will help you sleep. He was too weak to resist, too trusting to question. He drank obediently, his gaze fixed on her face, his eyes filled with a desperate, painful love. He saw his angel, his savior. He did not see the angel of death. After he had drained the glass, she laid him back against the pillows, stroking his forehead. He slipped into a deep, unnaturally still sleep within minutes. Eleanor watched his chest rise and fall, the rhythm slowing, becoming shallower. She stayed for nearly an hour, a silent observer at the edge of life and death, until she was certain the deed was done. But Arthur Vance was a man with a strong heart. He did not die. The next morning, the attending nurse found him unresponsive, his breathing dangerously slow, his skin cold and clammy. Panic ensued. The nurse called 911. Eleanor, feigning hysteria, flew into the room, crying Arthur's name. The paramedics arrived and worked frantically, administering naloxone to counteract the opioid overdose. Arthur was rushed to the hospital, his life hanging by a thread. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. The hospital was an uncontrolled environment. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit world of the ICU, she was no longer the sole gatekeeper. Doctors and nurses were now in charge, and worse, the unexplained overdose had raised a red flag. Dr. Albright questioned her closely. Eleanor, the level of morphine in his system was dangerously high. Can you think of any reason this could have happened? Did he seem confused? Could he have taken an extra dose by mistake? Eleanor crumpled, playing the part of the distraught, bewildered wife. I don't know. He was in so much pain last night. Maybe he was trying to end it? She choked out, planting a new seed of deception. Suicide. It was a plausible explanation for a man in his condition. But the incident had another, more dangerous consequence. It gave Ben Carter the opening he needed. Hearing that Arthur was in the ICU, he drove straight to the hospital, and this time there was no Eleanor to bar his way. He found Arthur unconscious, hooked up to a ventilator, a web of tubes and wires connecting him to a symphony of beeping machines. Seeing his friend so diminished, so close to death, Ben's suspicion hardened into cold certainty. This was not the work of some mysterious illness. This was the work of Eleanor. He went straight from the hospital to the office of Jonathan Mills, the family lawyer. Mills, a cautious, methodical man in his late 60s, listened patiently as Ben paced his office, his voice thick with a mixture of grief and rage. Jonathan, you have to do something. She's been isolating him for months. His health collapsed right after they got married. And now, a convenient overdose? It's too much to be a coincidence. She's killing him. Ben, these are extremely serious allegations, Mills said, his brow furrowed. Do you have any proof? No, I don't have proof. That's the problem. She's too smart, too careful. But in my gut, I know it. Arthur was healthy. He was happy. And then she came along and now he's dying. We need to protect him. We need to protect his estate. The lawyer considered this. Ben's distress was genuine, and the circumstances were, admittedly, suspicious. While he couldn't act on suspicion alone, he could take precautions. Arthur's will is secure with me, Ben. He was very clear about his intentions. 70% goes to charity. Eleanor is well provided for, but she does not control the estate. The conversation planted a seed of doubt in the lawyer's mind. He made a quiet call to Dr. Albright, inquiring about Arthur's condition. He asked careful, professional questions, but the doctor's description of the baffling symptoms and the sudden overdose only deepened his unease. A week later, Arthur was discharged from the hospital. His condition stabilized, but his prognosis grim. The overdose had weakened him irreparably. He was sent home with hospice care. This, Eleanor knew, was the final act. She had failed to hasten his death, but the end was now inevitable. She redoubled her efforts, playing the role of the wife who had almost lost her husband. Her relief at his return matched only by her sorrow at his terminal state. 2 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Arthur Vance Jr. died in his sleep. Eleanor was the one who found him. Her scream was perfectly timed, piercing the funereal silence of the grand house. It was a scream not of grief, but of triumph. The obstacle was finally gone. The 9-figure fortune was hers for the taking. The curtain had fallen on Arthur's life, and she was ready for her starring role as the wealthiest widow in Connecticut. The funeral of Arthur Vance Jr. was an event of somber elegance, meticulously orchestrated by his grieving widow. Eleanor, clad in a bespoke black dress and a veil that shadowed her porcelain features, was the very picture of tragic grace. She moved through the crowd of mourners at the wake held in the grand ballroom of the estate, accepting condolences with a quiet dignity that had society matrons weeping in sympathy. She spoke of Arthur's kindness, his generosity, his quiet strength, her voice trembling just enough to be convincing. She was magnificent in her deception. Ben Carter watched her from across the room, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. He felt a profound, nauseating disgust. He saw not a grieving widow but a predator celebrating her kill. He saw the subtle, triumphant gleam in her eyes that the veil couldn't quite conceal. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was looking at a murderer. A week after the funeral, the key players gathered in the leather and mahogany confines of Jonathan Mills's law office for the reading of the will. The air was thick with tension. Eleanor sat opposite the lawyer's desk, flanked by her own attorney, a slick, expensive-looking man she had hired the day after Arthur's death. Ben was there, as was the director of the Vance Family Charitable Foundation and a representative from the Children's Hospital. They were expecting the validation of the will. They all knew, the one that secured their institution's futures and honored Arthur's lifelong commitment to philanthropy. Jonathan Mills cleared his throat, his expression grim. "We are gathered today to execute the last will and testament of Arthur Vance Jr. I have here the document that Arthur filed with my office 2 years ago." "Excuse me, Mr. Mills," Eleanor's lawyer interjected smoothly, "but I believe there is a more recent document. My client has the true last will and testament of her late husband, signed and witnessed just over a month before his passing." Eleanor opened her designer handbag and produced a crisp, folded document, handing it across the desk. "Arthur's mind was wandering near the end," she said, her voice soft and sorrowful. "But he had moments of profound clarity. In one of those moments, he became very distressed about the complexity of his old will. He said his only wish was to know that I would be secure. He didn't want me to be burdened with boards and charities. He wanted to simplify things. He drafted this himself and had it witnessed by 2 of the staff." Mills took the document, his hands betraying a slight tremor. As he read it, his face hardened. It was short, brutally simple, and it revoked all previous wills. It named Eleanor as the sole executrix and beneficiary. It was a complete and total reversal of everything Arthur had ever stood for. "This is an outrage," the foundation director exclaimed. Ben slammed his hand on the table. "She's lying. Arthur would never do this. Never." Mills held up a hand for silence. He examined the document with a practiced eye. The paper felt right. The ink was the correct color. And the signature, it was undeniably Arthur's. Or was it? It looked perfect. Almost too perfect. It was the signature of a healthy man, not one whose hands were crippled with neuropathic pain. "The witnesses," Mills said, his voice cold. "Susan Peterson and Robert Jones. I don't recognize these names from the household staff list." "They were temporary help," Eleanor replied without missing a beat. "A gardener and a chambermaid. Their placements ended shortly after. I believe they were from an agency." She was calm, prepared, her story seamless. Legally, Mills was in a bind. The document appeared valid on its face. It was dated more recently than the one he held. Barring a formal challenge, he would be obligated to execute it. But every instinct he possessed screamed that it was a forgery. The meeting ended in an uproar. As Eleanor swept out of the office, a serene smile playing on her lips, Ben turned to Mills, his face pale with fury. "Jonathan, we cannot let this stand. We have to fight this. A will contest is a long, expensive, and difficult process. Ben, the lawyer warned. "We need more than just a gut feeling. We need proof." "Then we'll find it," Ben vowed. The first step was to find the ghost witnesses. Ben hired a private investigator, a former NYPD detective named Frank Russo, a tenacious bulldog of a man. Russo's search for Susan Peterson and Robert Jones hit a dead end almost immediately. The employment agencies Eleanor had vaguely alluded to had no record of them. The Vance estate's payroll records showed no such names. They didn't exist. They were phantoms. This was the first concrete crack in Eleanor's story. Next, Mills insisted on submitting the will for forensic analysis. A renowned handwriting expert, Dr. Alistair Finch, was brought in. Dr. Finch spent days examining the document under high-powered microscopes, analyzing the ink composition and the paper fibers. His report was the second and most damning blow to Eleanor's claim. "The signature of Arthur Vance is a forgery," Dr. Finch stated unequivocally in his affidavit. "A remarkably skillful one, but a forgery nonetheless. The pressure on the paper is unnaturally even, with none of the subtle variations in speed and force that characterize a genuine signature. The pen strokes indicate a slow, careful drawing motion, not a fluid, practiced signature. It is what we call a tracing simulation. Furthermore," he added, "the signatures of the so-called witnesses show striking stylistic similarities to each other, suggesting they were written by the same hand, a hand attempting to disguise itself." The third, and most crucial, front of the investigation was the cause of Arthur's death. Ben was haunted by his friend's rapid decline and the convenient overdose. The official cause of death had been listed as complications from a severe neurodegenerative disorder. Ben refused to accept it. He petitioned the court, using the suspicious will as grounds, to have Arthur's body exhumed for a full autopsy and toxicology screening. Eleanor fought the petition with all the legal firepower her new fortune could buy, arguing it was a cruel and unnecessary desecration of her husband's memory. Her fierce opposition was, in itself, a red flag. Why would a grieving widow fight so hard to prevent the truth from being known? The judge, seeing the mounting evidence of fraud surrounding the will, granted Ben's request. The exhumation was a grim, somber affair, but the results it yielded were explosive. The medical examiner, Dr. Ishida, was a leading forensic toxicologist. Because of the suspicion of a long-term illness, she didn't just screen for common poisons. She conducted a comprehensive heavy metals panel on tissue samples from Arthur's hair, nails, and kidneys. The report came back a month later. It was the final nail in Eleanor's coffin. The tissue samples show massively elevated levels of thallium, Dr. Ishida explained to Ben, Mills, and 2 detectives from the Connecticut State Police. Levels that are not just toxic, but unequivocally lethal. These are not trace amounts from environmental exposure. This was chronic, systematic poisoning over a period of many months. The symptoms described in Mr. Vance's medical records, the neuropathy, the hair loss, the gastrointestinal distress, are classic presentations of thallium toxicity. His doctors were looking for a rare disease, but they should have been looking for a poisoner. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with brutal clarity. The perfect wife, the sudden illness, the isolation, the baffling symptoms, the forged will, the convenient death. It was a mosaic of pure, cold-blooded evil. Armed with the forensics from the will and the toxicology report, the detectives arrested Eleanor Vance at the estate. She was in the middle of planning a trip to the south of France, her bags half-packed with new designer clothes. She showed no emotion as they read her rights and placed her in handcuffs. Her mask of composure was still perfectly in place. She was utterly confident they had nothing on her. The trial was the media event of the decade. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical precision. Dr. Finch testified about the forged will. The private investigator testified about the non-existent witnesses. Dr. Ishida presented the damning toxicology report, explaining in chilling detail how thallium had ravaged Arthur's body from the inside out. The nurses testified about Eleanor's controlling behavior and her convenient suicide theory after the opioid overdose attempt. The prosecution argued, to either hasten Arthur's death or muddy the waters about its cause. The most powerful testimony came from Ben Carter. On the stand, his voice choked with emotion, he told the jury about the vibrant, trusting man Arthur had been, and how he had watched his best friend fade away under the watchful, malevolent care of his wife. Eleanor's defense was that she was the victim of a conspiracy, a witch hunt orchestrated by Ben Carter and the Jilted Charities, who were furious about being cut out of the will. Her lawyers argued that Arthur, in his confused state, had somehow ingested the thallium accidentally, perhaps from old rat poison in the mansion's basement. They portrayed Eleanor as a loving wife, now being persecuted for honoring her husband's final wishes. Eleanor herself took the stand. She was brilliant. She was poised, articulate, and sympathetic. She wept as she described Arthur's suffering. She looked the jury in the eye and swore that she had loved her husband with all her heart. For a moment, she was so convincing that a shadow of doubt flickered in the courtroom. But the prosecution had one last card to play. They presented evidence of Eleanor's dark web searches for tasteless, untraceable poisons and thallium salt for sale, discovered on the encrypted laptop from her study. And they presented the P.O. box, opened under a false name, to which the vial had been delivered. Faced with the digital ghost of her own meticulous planning, Eleanor's composure finally shattered. The mask cracked, and for a fleeting second, the jury saw the cold, reptilian fury beneath. The verdict came back after only 3 hours of deliberation. Guilty, on all counts, forgery and first-degree murder. Eleanor Vance, the flawless wife, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The forged will was thrown out, and Arthur's true will was honored, his vast fortune flowing to the charities he had so loved. The Vance estate was sold, its opulent rooms emptied of their secrets. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But for Ben Carter, the victory was hollow. He had exposed a monster and honored his friend's legacy, but it would never bring back the kind, trusting man who had been stolen from the world, betrayed by the beautiful face of the one person he had sworn to love forever.